Hello, this is Alex, and I am looking at a photo from New Zealand that my friend Mark sent me as a little bit of a challenge, or perhaps just what would you do with this kind of question. So we're going to look at what can be done with this picture when developing it in Lightroom and Lightroom alone. You see that this is a very challenging exposure, deep, dark blacks and extremely bright highlights. The highlights are in fact blown out. And so just looking at this here, reducing the highlights, you see, doesn't lead to any recovery here. So in a situation like this, it's best to leave those alone and not trying to fight them too hard and just recover them a little bit to retain a natural look. But you see the transition here in this waterfall area is actually quite beautiful. And if I would reduce the highlights too much, then I get this odd white looking washed out streak in the center with nothing else. So reducing the highlights just a little bit would be a great way to preserve that natural look and the beautiful soft transition. But before we begin to work on a high contrast image, it is very advisable to look at the color profile that we're using, the starting profile. And Adobe Color has a fair amount of contrast and color saturation as well. So for high contrast images, it is not a good starting point actually. I would suggest maybe switching to Adobe Neutral or the camera matching profile, Camera Neutral. In this instance here, Camera Neutral only makes the highlights a little bit darker, whereas Adobe Neutral gives us much more open shadows. So this is a better way to start working on a high contrast image, because if we were to work on these sliders here, we wouldn't have to fight them that hard. The other thing that we want to evaluate is the white balance. Here as shot, you can see that the camera's auto white balance shows 4800K and a magenta tint of +20. This is both a little bit cool and a little bit much. This comes probably from the amount of green that's in the image that the camera tried to neutralize with this +20 tint. So we want to fix that, and one of the easiest ways to do that is by just choosing one of Adobe's presets for the daylight white balance, for example. This makes the color temperature warmer, reduces the green tint, looks much more natural because this odd magenta tint disappears from the water here, and the greens look more lively and less washed out than with the stronger magenta tint. Alternatively, we could press the white balance picker here and then place it onto an area that we would assume is neutral gray in the image, like this here, or perhaps onto those rocks here. And the rocks actually have a much cooler color, so this is not a good spot. I think where we were with the daylight white balance here from Adobe 5500K is a pretty good starting point for our work on the image, and we might make some local adjustments to parts of the color in the image later on. After we have chosen a profile and evaluated and adjusted our white balance, we want to remove some distractions. In this image, there are two bigger distractions, these lens flares here, which are the result of these highlights shining directly into the lens at 24mm, and this branch that's sticking into the frame down here. There are also some smaller distractions. I think I might take out this little sliver of mosses here, even though it's natural. It looks a little bit out of place here. And there might be some other areas when we inspect the areas here closer where we want to take out some small distractions. But let's begin with the lens flare here. And for this, we could actually use the normal patch or heal tool, but in this instance, since we have the ability, I would choose the generative AI removal feature, because it just makes our life easier to just have the machine make up some pixels for us in an area that's actually not too big, because I'm zoomed in here to 200%. With this selection in place, I hit apply, and let's just see what the generative AI will spit out for us. And here is the first variation of patches that actually looks pretty nice, because it picks up that line here and then creates a new rock going up here. But we can inspect the other variations too. The second one has even more detail in the rocks. That's probably not bad considering what was underneath the original. And the third one creates some odd shapes in here. So I think the first one is actually pretty good. The second one is close. I like more of how the light and darkness is preserved here in that first one. So I'm going to go with this one. And then I move over to the branch at the bottom of the frame here. And we're going to remove that one exactly the same way with the generative remove. And I paint over this branch here, and I will also include this odd shape here because that looks a little bit out of place. And I'm generous with my outlines and hit apply to see what kind of variations we will get here from the Firefly that runs in Adobe's cloud. And this looks decent. And this is very nice because it continues with these rocks and the flow patterns. And that creates a little bit of an odd transition in here. So I would say it's either number 2 or number 1. I think with the way these wavy patterns here are continued and the least amount of color error that we're seeing here, this is probably the best variation. Here is something that looks almost like a chromatic aberration. Okay, we have these 2 big distractions removed, and I mentioned the smaller distractions here. I'm going to go into those, and for this I just use the normal heal tool, and I make my tool smaller here with my mouse wheel and simply paint over this to get rid of this bit of moss here, maybe that one as well, because this just draws attention where we don't need it. For the rest of the frame, here we have a small stick that's kind of an intrusion, not that it would really matter here. I think we might make a little bit of an adjustment here with our cursor keys to bring that into a nicer area. That looks good. And now that I've zoomed in here, I see there's actually the water indicating a strong tilt of the image, which is quite curious. So we want to adjust for that. So I go to the crop tool and I add an overlay with the H key so I can see this. And now I try to straighten this, and I might have to zoom in to see when the water is most straight because it's not a big detail. And I think here this looks actually pretty good. But when I look at the waterfall now, I see that this waterfall almost appears to be flowing a little bit towards the right. So this might be too much, and this is owed to the perspective distortion, right? So this line isn't straight here. So in this instance, we have the water straightened, but now the waterfall looks unrealistic in its flow pattern, because that's actually a little bit too straight almost. So the crop tool is not the best way to straighten this image. Instead, I would choose the transform tool and choose the guided transform, where I can put up to 2 vertical and 2 horizontal guides into the frame. I will have to zoom into the water here, and I follow this line like so. This is my first guide. And then here in the waterfall, I find one of these small streaks of water that's so small that I can be sure that this would fall pretty much straight down. There's another one down here that I could pick up as well. So maybe I choose this one here because it's a really fine line. And I just place my vertical guide over this here. And I have a straightening that looks much more natural and realistic. But I still want to go back to my crop tool to remove some other areas here by cropping. I don't mind the very elongated 2x3 format in a picture like this because it's nicely filled with content. But I do not like so much that the continuation of the blown out areas here at the top is very fine and highly textured and creates a distraction. So for this particular image, I would perhaps choose a 4:3 aspect ratio. I want to keep this all the way to the bottom here to get rid of that top part as quickly as possible, which also helps to get this brighter area here of the rock out of the way. That also draws some attention where I don't need it. And maybe I can even go in a little bit here from the side to crop this tighter. Alrighty, I think that's a nice crop. Or what about this corner here? I think we can lose that. So I go to like this spot here. That's nice. Okay, this is our cropping. And now that we have prepared the image globally with a profile, a white balance, removal of distractions, cropping, we can look at how we can work on the individual strengths and weaknesses in the picture to emphasize the strengths and de-emphasize the weaknesses. I find that the center of attention in the image is probably down here in this area where it's relatively dark. So our eye is naturally drawn towards the brighter parts here. Up here, brightness always attracts more attention. And I earlier on mentioned that I would perhaps reduce the highlights a little bit to recover some of this blown out stuff here, but retaining a nice look of this spray of that little waterfall. So just -22 is a pretty good value. And just looking at how dark the shadows are, maybe I want to lift those out of the darkest parts a little bit as well, like here. And then with all this spray and the softness in here, where we patched some with the generative fill, I feel like we could add some dehaze and just solidify the overall appearance of the image here. Give it more presence. That looks good. And with that, we want to dive in and just balance the brightness levels now. So I choose my brush here, and I begin with an exposure correction with a +1, with dodging or lightening tool. And I have my flow set to 50 so that I can brush over an area multiple times and build up an effect. I use a relatively large brush, and I just begin in that bottom area here where I want more attention. In particular, it is almost like heart-shaped rock, the glistening rocks here, and of course the stream that kind of flows out here and where we will kind of pick up almost like a leading line down here, right? So all this can be brighter. And maybe I add just a hint of more brightness in those darkest shadow areas here as well. I think that improves it already and gets us more attention where we want it. And on the other end of the spectrum, we want to create some burning or darkening of areas where we want less attention. I create another mask with another brush, and I choose a burn tool, make this a little bit stronger perhaps, and reduce my flow so that I can brush more of the effect slowly over the areas where I want it. Here at the bottom of the frame, I'm going to darken this quite a bit because that's not where we want the attention to go, so that it will be easier to pick up on a stream here. Maybe this top corner in the rock area here can be a little bit darker. This rock as well. We don't need so much attention here. Make this smaller, go more surgically over this here. There's a little spot of moss up here where I would burn a little bit at the top. That's good. Let's make this entire top area a little bit darker so that there's not so much attention going to those areas. It's almost like applying a vignette more selectively to our frame, right? This edge here can be a little bit darker. Okay, just these two masks, one for our dodging, one for our burning. Shift the attention nicely more towards the bottom of the frame. But we can further enhance this and add more presence and detail to those areas here where we want the most attention. This works really well with a combination of some whites and some clarity, like so. And again, with my brush with a flow set like 50, I can set this flow in increments of 10 by pressing the number keys on my keyboard 1 through 9. I brush this clarity and whites adjustment over these mossy areas here, over this rivulet of water, mossy areas here, maybe even this ledge and the top part here to have a sharper separation of this nice shape. Along here as well, doesn't hurt. And into those glistening rocks here along the river as well. Maybe those two. And going along the flow of the water here, I can highlight these white parts of the ripples in that stream. That looks good as well. And maybe I broke out some detail on those pebbles here that are really nice. Okay, this further enhances the detail and the attention that goes to the center part of the image where we want to draw more attention to the beautiful features in the frame. Okay, this leaves our very bright spot at the top here that we maybe want to soften somehow. I mentioned when something's so blown out, it's best to not fight it too hard and instead embrace it. And I can do that with negative dehaze. I added some positive dehaze effect, so now I would choose negative dehaze and just open that over here to kind of soften these areas where the bleed already is from the overexposure, to make that even softer so that it bleeds more onto these rocks and gives it a very soft glowy effect here, as if some light comes in here. And maybe I even make that light a little bit warmer to help with this glowing effect, as if there's sunlight shining into this deep gorge, right? Okay, and on the other part where we make this warmer, perhaps we want to increase some color contrast and make that water a little bit cooler. So for that I would create a mask with a brush and just choose a negative white balance adjustment, make that cooler, and I brush over the water here to make this cooler. Adjust my brush size on the go with my mouse wheel, make this cooler so that the water is more refreshing, cool, inviting. And I think I can take this up here towards this falling water as well to give this a cool impression. And with the brush, if I find that I overdo it, I can press the Option or Alt key, switch to my erase brush, and then just blend this and create a more subtle transition here so that I don't overdo it. Since we have chosen the Adobe Neutral profile, it's beneficial to add some vibrance, because the Adobe Neutral profile is very, very tame in its color saturation. So I can push that up, which helps with the greens and also with the cool part of the water that we enhanced. And looking at these greens, maybe I want to make them more lively still. I can go to my color mixer in the hue adjustments here. I can push this green toward the cooler tones, and that affects a part of these mosses and just creates a greater separation in the tones, and also makes these mosses look much more lively, like they've just been sprayed by fresh water and are thus very, very lush and green, right? Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Maybe with regards to the definition, we should do something about these darkest areas of the frame here so that there's more of a detail in here. And I could actually go back to my brush that I already used with the whites and attempt to just brush some over that here. And that works to bring out some of these rock details so that they don't look that dark and have more detail, which will work out well, in particular if we put this rook on paper, like so. Okay, and I think with that we have quite a nice transformation of this picture, going from the way it came straight out of camera with a super strong contrast and color rendition that was a bit wrong and the distractions, into a very beautiful and inviting rendition of the image that brings a lot more attention to the areas where we really want it. I hope you liked this video. Thanks a lot to Mark for the challenge, sending this picture in for some developing in Lightroom. That's it for me today. Have a nice morning, noon, afternoon, or evening, or night. Until next time, bye.